What moment made you lose all respect for authority figures? I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass. On our camera, I saw a man in a ski mask carrying my 8-year-old Cecilia to a white van. When I got to the police station, Officer Wang was working his way through what looked like a day-old sub sandwich. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. Kids run off all the time, especially at this age." "Someone took her!" I shoved my phone in his face so hard he had to lean back. "Look at the video!" He gave it maybe 2 seconds before pushing my hand away. "That's probably just her father picking her up. What's your custody situation? These domestic disputes always get messy." "Her father died 2 years ago in Afghanistan." The words came out as a sob. Wang leaned back in his chair until it creaked. "Look, I've been doing this for 20 years. I know the difference between a real kidnapping and..." He looked me up and down, taking in my silk bonnet and hastily thrown-on robe. "Certain communities that don't supervise their children properly. Those people's kids always run off. They'll be back by morning when they get hungry." My stomach dropped through the floor. This wasn't happening. Not now. Not when every second counted. That's when my security guard neighbor burst through the door. I'd called him to meet me at the station with the van's license plate, but Wang didn't even pretend to look at Blake's phone. Could be an Uber. Kids are sneaky these days. Probably met some boy online. "She's 8 years old," I screamed, but he just went back to his sandwich. I pulled up Find My iPhone with trembling fingers. It had been disconnected, but her last location was outside of our home. "Look! He's taking her somewhere. She probably threw it in someone's truck to throw you off. Kids watch too much TV these days. We're wasting time." Blake was pacing now, his keys jangling. "The first hour is crucial for kidnapping recovery." Wang's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Anyone who goes behind my back to another department will regret it. I will warn them that you're delusional and don't know what you're talking about. I'm not having some fake crime spike ruining my chance at a promotion." We were trapped, and Cecilia was getting further from me every second. That's when Gus's truck screeched into the parking lot. My brother-in-law was a detective in the next county, and I'd called him in desperation. It took over 100 calls for him to finally pick up. His face went sheet white when Blake showed him the van footage. "My goodness, that's the van from the multi-county task force alerts. 3 Amber Alerts this month, all girls between 7 and 10. Wang finally stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "Stay in your jurisdiction, detective. This is my station." But Gus was already on his phone, calling state police. "White van, license plate Baker 74. You can't override my authority in my station." Wang lunged across the desk, grabbing for Gus's phone. Young trainee Officer Healy, who'd been quietly watching from the corner, finally spoke up. "Sir, shouldn't we at least put out a BOLO, just to be safe?" Wang whirled on him. "Question me again and you're on parking duty for the rest of your career. Meter maid Healy has a nice ring to it." Gus's phone buzzed with an incoming text. His face went pale. "Van belongs to John Smith, registered SX offender who just moved here from Alabama. 3 convictions. Issue the Amber Alert now!" I screamed so loud the windows rattled. The station was filled with neighbors now, all holding up phones, recording everything. Wang's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "Everyone out! You're obstructing justice! This is an active crime scene. The only crime here is you," Gus shouted. "I'm calling Chief Pitt directly." Wang lunged for Gus's phone again, and they crashed into the desk. Papers flew everywhere as they struggled. In the chaos, I saw Healy quietly sliding over to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he input the Amber Alert while Wang was distracted. The next 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. The chase was brief but terrifying, ending when spike strips sent the van careening into a drainage ditch. They found Cecilia in the back of a van, bound with zip ties but alive, thank goodness. 2 other girls were with her, both reported missing from Georgia and Tennessee weeks ago. Wang was arrested that night for criminal negligence and obstruction of justice. He lost his pension, his freedom, and any chance of ever wearing a badge again. The judge gave him 1.5 years in prison, and his name and case was never published to protect his identity. Well, that wasn't enough for me. He gambled with my baby's life for a pay raise, so I was ready to destroy him completely. We all were. The first thing I did was get on my laptop and start digging into everything about the state prison. I found their website and started taking screenshots of visiting hours and rules. The intake schedule showed new prisoners arrived on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Guard shifts changed at 6 a.m., 2 p.m., and 10 p.m., according to a news article from last year. I printed out maps of the facility from Google Earth and marked every entrance and exit I could see. Blake came by the next morning with coffee and sat down at my kitchen table. He pulled out his phone and showed me a contact named Stefan Marino. Blake explained that Stefan worked at the prison and had heard about Wang's case on the news. Stefan's daughter was the same age as Cecilia, and he was disgusted by what Wang did. Blake had met Stefan years ago doing security work and called him when Wang got sentenced. Stefan agreed to meet us at a diner off the highway that afternoon. When we got there, Stefan was already in a back booth wearing civilian clothes. He told us Wang had been assigned to cell block D and gave us his daily schedule. Wang ate breakfast at 6:30, had an hour in the yard at 10, lunch at noon, another yard hour at 3, and dinner at 5:30. Stefan said the other guards already knew what Wang did, and nobody was happy about having him there. My phone rang 2 days later while I was making Cecilia breakfast. The woman on the other end said her name was Rania Caldwell. Her daughter was one of the girls in the van with Cecilia. She asked if we could meet for coffee because she needed to talk to someone who understood. We met at a Starbucks downtown, and she looked exhausted. Rania told me she couldn't sleep knowing Wang only got 18 months. Her daughter was having panic attacks and wouldn't go anywhere alone. She asked if I'd thought about what happens when Wang gets out. I told her I'd been thinking about nothing else. By the end of the week, 12 parents were sitting in folding chairs in my basement. Blake brought 3 families whose kids went to Cecilia's school. Rania brought 2 moms from her daughter's therapy group. Everyone had stories about Wang ignoring their calls or dismissing their concerns over the years. One dad showed us a complaint he'd filed 2 years ago that Wang threw away. Another mom had dashcam footage of Wang letting his buddy go after running a red light. We were all mad, and we all wanted something done about it. Manuel Velasquez showed up at our second meeting wearing jeans and a baseball cap. He'd prosecuted Wang and was furious about the light sentence. Manuel explained that with good behavior, Wang would probably serve 9 months at most. The judge had sealed Wang's records to protect him from harassment after release. He could move anywhere and start fresh while our kids were still in therapy. Manuel couldn't officially help us, but he could share public information about the legal system. He showed us how to file information requests and track court documents. Someone suggested we needed a name for our group. After some discussion, we settled on The Watch because we'd be watching Wang forever. I set up an encrypted group chat and everyone joined within minutes. People started sharing what they could contribute to our cause. One parent worked in IT and could help with online research. Another owned a printing shop and offered to make flyers if needed. A retired cop said he still had contacts who might share information. Everyone wanted to help somehow. Stefan sent a message to our group that night with news about Wang. The other inmates had found out Wang was a cop who let kids get hurt. Word spread fast and Wang had been moved to protective custody for his own safety. He ate all his meals alone in his cell now. He exercised alone in a small fenced area instead of the main yard. Even criminals hated cops who endangered children. I called the prison the next day pretending to be a journalist. I told them I was writing a book about rehabilitation programs in state prisons. The secretary transferred me to the warden's assistant, who scheduled a tour for the following week. When I arrived, I wore glasses and carried a notebook to look professional. The warden showed me around for 2 hours, explaining their programs and pointing out different areas. I memorized where every camera was mounted and which hallways had blind spots. I noted the staff break room locations and where guards stationed themselves. I asked lots of questions about their success stories to keep him talking. That night, I heard Cecilia crying in her room. She'd overheard me on the phone talking to Rania about Wang. She asked if the bad policeman could hurt her again. I held her tight and promised he couldn't, but I realized I needed to be more careful. We decided to move our meetings to Rania's house, which was across town. Her husband traveled for work, and her daughter went to her mom's house every Thursday. The basement was bigger than mine anyway. 3 weeks after Wang went to prison, my phone rang from an unknown number. Valerie Rice introduced herself as a reporter for the local news. She'd been following Wang's case and wanted to do a story about how the community was coping. Her husband Derek ran our neighborhood watch program. She said they both wanted to help however they could. We met at a park while our kids played on the swings. Valerie explained she couldn't name Wang directly, but she could keep his story alive. Derek had already recruited 20 neighbors to keep tabs on Wang's sister's house. They both joined the watch that day. 2 days later, Stefan called me with something that made my blood boil. He'd been doing his rounds in the prison when he saw Wang at the mail desk writing letters to his old cop buddies. Stefan managed to get close enough to snap a photo of one letter, where Wang was joking about getting out soon, and how those bratty kids and their hysterical mothers had ruined his career over nothing. I printed out that photo and showed it to everyone at our next meeting. People were shaking their heads and clenching their fists. The next morning, I had to take Cecilia to her therapy appointment at the Children's Center downtown. The therapist pulled me aside after the session and told me Cecilia had asked during their talk if the bad policeman could hurt other kids now. My throat got tight and I had to lie to my baby and tell her no. He couldn't hurt anyone anymore. But that lie just made me more determined to make it true. Manuel called an emergency meeting that night at Rania's house. He spread out documents on the coffee table showing Wang's pension details. The system wasn't just protecting his name from the public. It was going to pay him full benefits after his release. Every month he'd get a check from taxpayer money, the same taxpayers whose kids he'd put in danger. Manuel showed us the math, and Wang would be getting almost $3,000 a month for the rest of his life. We sat there staring at those papers while Manuel explained there was nothing we could do about it legally. The pension was protected by union contracts and state law. Then Manuel dropped another bomb on us. Wang had a parole hearing scheduled in just 4 months. With good behavior and completing their joke of a rehabilitation program, he could be out before summer. The overcrowding in the prison system meant they were pushing everyone through as fast as possible. Wang just had to sit through some classes about anger management and write a fake apology letter, and he'd be back on the streets. Blake had been doing his own digging and discovered something about Wang's sister. She'd been visiting him every single week, putting money in his commissary account so he could buy snacks and phone cards. She lived 2 towns over and was still telling anyone who'd listen that her brother was just doing his job, and we'd all overreacted. Blake had followed her one day and heard her at the grocery store telling the cashier that those kids probably were runaways and we'd just gotten lucky finding them. Our group decided we needed someone on the inside for when Wang got released. We needed to know where he'd go and what he'd do. Derek raised his hand and said he'd join the same gym Wang used to go to before prison. He'd been meaning to get back in shape anyway, and could easily strike up conversations with the staff and regulars there. Everyone agreed it was a good plan. Stefan texted me the next week with more news about Wang. He'd gotten into a big argument with another guard about the Amber Alert system. Wang was still insisting he'd been right, that most missing kids are just runaways looking for attention. The other guard had a daughter and told Wang he was lucky to be in protective custody, or he'd teach him a lesson about ignoring missing kids. Wang just laughed and said statistics were on his side. I couldn't sleep that night thinking about him still believing he'd done nothing wrong. The next day, I had to drive across town for errands and decided to go past Wang's old house. There was a for sale sign in the front yard, and the grass was overgrown. The realtor's flyer said it had been on the market for 2 months. I asked around and found out Wang's ex-wife had packed up their kids and left the state right after the trial. She wanted nothing to do with him or the shame he'd brought on their family. She'd even changed back to her maiden name and enrolled the kids in the school under it. 3 months into his sentence, Stefan told us Wang had applied for work release. He claimed in his application that he wanted to contribute to society and show he was reformed. But Stefan knew the real reason from talking to other guards. The general population inmates had figured out who Wang was and what he'd done. They'd been sliding threatening notes under his door every night. One said they had friends on the outside who knew where his sister lived. Another had a drawing of a cop badge with a knife through it. Wang was scared and wanted any excuse to get out of that cell during the day. Meanwhile at home, Rania's daughter had started art therapy as part of her recovery. Rania showed me a picture her daughter had drawn of a police officer behind bars with a big lock on the cell door. When the therapist asked her about it, she said it made her feel safe knowing the mean man couldn't leave and hurt other kids. Rania had tears in her eyes showing me that drawing. The next morning, Manuel called with news that made my coffee taste like dirt. The parole board had scheduled Wang's hearing for next month, and with prison overcrowding and his clean record inside, Manuel said he had a 70% chance of getting out early. I threw my phone across the room so hard the case cracked. That night, we all met at Rania's house, and everyone was ready to put their money where their mouth was. We passed around a hat, and within 20 minutes had enough to hire a private investigator for 6 months of surveillance once Wang got released. The PI turned out to be this older guy who used to be a cop but quit in disgust after Wang's case made the news. He showed us his equipment, cameras smaller than buttons and tracking devices that could stick under cars. 3 days later, I was making dinner when Cecilia came into the kitchen and wrapped her arms around my waist. She asked why I seemed mad all the time and if it was because of her. My heart broke into 1,000 pieces as I knelt down and told her I wasn't mad at her, just at some bad things that happened to bad people. She hugged me tight and said she hoped I would feel better soon. I had to turn away so she wouldn't see me crying. Stefan texted the group chat that week with more updates from inside. Wang had gotten himself a cushy job in the prison library, where he spent all day reading law books and taking notes. Stefan said the other guards were pretty sure Wang was planning to sue the department for not protecting his identity better after he got out. The watch kept growing bigger every week. We had 25 members now, including teachers from 3 different school districts, coaches from the youth soccer league, and parents whose kids went to schools all over the county. Every single person had a story about Wang ignoring their calls for help or dismissing their concerns about their kids. One mom said Wang had told her that her son's black eye from a bully was just boys being boys. Another dad said Wang refused to file a report when his daughter's bike was stolen right off school property. Valerie worked her magic with the local paper and got them to publish an article about the unnamed officer who had nearly cost 3 girls their lives. She couldn't use Wang's name directly, but she made sure to include quotes from parents whose kids could have been the next victims if Cecilia hadn't been rescued in time. The article ran on the front page with a photo of the van they'd pulled those girls from. My neighbor saw it and asked if that was the same officer from our station. I just nodded and she shook her head in disgust. 2 weeks before the parole hearing, Wang's lawyer filed a motion claiming his client was suffering in cruel conditions in protective custody. The lawyer wanted Wang moved to minimum security, or better yet, released early on ankle monitoring so he could start rebuilding his life. I wanted to scream when I read the document Stefan photographed for us. The motion hearing was set for the following Tuesday, and I made sure to be there along with 10 other parents from the watch. We sat in the back row like a silent wall of judgment. Wang walked in wearing his orange jumpsuit and kept his eyes on the floor the whole time. He wouldn't look at us, but we made damn sure he knew we were there. Every time he shifted in his seat, one of us would shift too. When his lawyer stood up to argue about the conditions, we all leaned forward just a little bit. The judge listened to both sides for what felt like hours before finally denying the transfer request. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. He suggested Wang might benefit from a work release program to help him transition back to society. The prosecutor objected, but the judge said he'd consider it at the next review. I had to bite my tongue so hard it bled to keep from screaming in that courtroom. Blake had been talking to one of his contacts who worked in the prison and found out something that made us all sick. Wang had been going around telling other inmates that he'd been framed, that our whole community had turned against him because of his race. He was playing the victim to murderers and drug dealers, saying we'd made up the whole thing because we didn't like having an Asian cop in our neighborhood. Even the other criminals weren't buying his sob story, though. Blake's contact said one guy doing life for killing his wife told Wang to shut up, because at least he'd never put kids in danger. That same week, we gathered at Manuel's house and spread out a huge calendar across his dining room table. Stefan had gotten us copies of Wang's intake paperwork, and we marked every possible release date with red ink. The earliest he could get out was 9 months if he got good behavior credits, and completed the joke rehabilitation program they offered. Manuel pointed to different dates and explained how the parole board worked, how they met every month, but Wang's case wouldn't come up until at least month 7. Everyone took photos of the calendar on their phones, and we made a shared document, so any updates would go to all 25 members instantly. 3 days later, I was sitting in Cecilia's therapy appointment when the therapist pulled me aside after the session. She suggested we might want to think about moving to give Cecilia a fresh start somewhere new, where she wouldn't have all these reminders. I told her straight up that we weren't going anywhere because we didn't do anything wrong and I wasn't letting Wang drive us from our home. The therapist nodded, but I could tell she thought I was being stubborn. Stefan texted the group chat that night with news that made my skin crawl. Wang had put in a transfer request to a prison 3 states away, claiming he feared for his safety in our state. He wrote in his request that the local community had it out for him, and he needed protection. The request got denied 2 weeks later because that facility was already over capacity, and they weren't taking transfers. Manuel called an emergency meeting at his office downtown, where he could talk to us about legal stuff without worrying about being overheard. He explained that if Wang violated even the smallest parole condition like missing a check-in or going somewhere he wasn't supposed to, he'd go back to finish his full sentence. We spent the next 2 hours going through every single parole rule and talking about how we could legally document any violations we witnessed. Nobody was talking about doing anything illegal, but we all knew we'd be watching him like hawks. The parole hearing date came faster than I expected, and I showed up at the courthouse at 6 in the morning to make sure I got a seat. By the time the hearing started at 9:30, parents had packed into the small room and more were standing in the hallway. Wang walked in wearing a suit his sister must have brought him, and he kept his eyes on his shoes the whole time. His sister got up to speak first, and her voice shook as she told the board her brother was a good man who made one mistake. She kept glancing back at all of us sitting there and stumbling over her words. When it was my turn to testify, I brought a folder 3 inches thick with every receipt from Cecilia's therapy, every prescription for her anxiety medication, every note from her teacher about her struggles in the school since that night. I made sure the board understood that Wang didn't just mess up one night, but gave my daughter a life sentence of trauma. The board members kept writing notes but wouldn't make eye contact with me. Rania went next, and she completely broke down trying to describe how her daughter still checked the locks 5 times before bed and wouldn't go anywhere alone, even to the bathroom at the school. The board members shifted in their seats, and one of them actually checked his watch while she was crying. After 3 hours of testimony from parents, teachers, and even Cecilia's pediatrician who talked about the physical effects of trauma on children, the board took a break to deliberate. We all waited in the hallway and nobody said much, but everyone was holding hands or hugging. When they called us back in, the head of the board announced they were granting Wang parole starting in 6 weeks with standard conditions, including an ankle monitor and staying 500 feet from any school. My legs almost gave out, and I heard several parents start crying. That night, the watch met at Valerie's house and everyone was mad, but nobody was giving up. We knew the system had failed us again, just like it failed those 3 girls when Wang were ignored my kidnapping report. People started planning right away about how we'd handle his release and make sure he knew we were still watching. Stefan had to work, but he sent a text saying Wang would be released at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday through the back entrance of the prison. They were trying to avoid any media attention, but Stefan said he'd make sure we knew if anything changed. I went home that night and sat in Cecilia's room watching her sleep, thinking about how the system kept protecting Wang while my baby still woke up screaming some nights. The next few weeks were going to be about getting ready for his release and making sure he understood that getting out of prison didn't mean getting away from what he did. The first thing I did was pack Cecilia's favorite stuffed animals and her pink backpack with the sparkly straps. My mom lived 3 hours away and hadn't heard about Wang's release date yet. I told Cecilia we were going for a special visit to Grandma's house and she could stay there for a whole week. She was so excited about missing school and getting spoiled by Grandma that she didn't ask any questions. The drive felt longer than usual, and I kept checking my mirrors even though I knew Wang was still locked up. My mom took one look at my face when we got there and pulled me into the kitchen while Cecilia ran to the backyard. I told her everything about the release date, and she just nodded and promised to keep Cecilia busy with baking cookies and trips to the zoo. 5 days before Wang got out, Stefan sent me a photo of the ankle monitor that had just arrived at the prison. It was the cheap model the state used for low-risk parolees, and Stefan said it had dead zones all over town where the signal dropped. The thing looked like a big black watch, and Stefan said Wang had stared at it for 20 minutes when they showed it to him. Stefan also mentioned that Wang had been moved to a different cell block for his last few days because someone had left a note under his door. The note just said, "We're waiting," and Wang had gone straight to the guards demanding protection. Derek went to Wang's old gym that same day and signed up for a month-to-month membership. He started talking to the guy at the front desk about needing to get back in shape after his desk job made him soft. The desk guy mentioned that they still had some old lockers from members who never came back to clean them out. Derek asked if they ever checked them, and the guy laughed and said they hadn't opened the old ones in years. Wang's locker was number 47, and his membership was still being auto-paid from his sister's credit card. We spent the next evening at Valerie's house with a huge map of the town spread across her dining room table. Everyone had brought sticky notes, and we marked every single place Wang might go when he got out. His sister's house got a red dot, and so did the gym and 3 different grocery stores he used to shop at. The bars he went to after his shifts got yellow dots, and the restaurants where he ate lunch got green ones. Each location got assigned to different watch members who lived or worked nearby. Blake took the grocery store near the highway, and Rania said she could watch the coffee shop downtown from her office window. We had 25 people now and enough coverage to know where Wang was every minute of every day. Valerie showed us the script she'd written for her broadcast on release day, and even though she couldn't say Wang's name, she made sure everyone would know exactly who she meant. She was going to say, "a certain disgraced officer who endangered children," and mention the date of his arrest, so people could connect the dots. Her producer had already approved it and said they'd run it 3 times that day. The private investigator we'd hired drove by Wang's sister's house and took pictures of all the new stuff she'd installed. She had cameras on every corner of the house and motion lights that would turn on if anyone got close. The locks were all new too, and the investigator said they were the expensive kind that couldn't be picked. He also noticed she'd put up a fence around the backyard and gotten a big dog that barked at everyone who walked by. 2 days before the release, I was at the grocery store when Rania called me. Someone had spray-painted huge red letters on Wang's sister's driveway overnight. The words, "Child Endangerer lives here," were so big you could probably see them from a plane. His sister had called the police at 6 in the morning, but they didn't show up until after 9. Rania lived 2 streets over and said the cops just took some pictures and left without even trying to find witnesses. Wang's sister spent the rest of the day trying to scrub the paint off, but it had already stained the concrete. Stefan called that night with his final report before Wang got out. He said Wang hadn't been sleeping and looked terrible with dark circles under his eyes. The other guards said Wang kept asking if there would be protection when he left, but they just shrugged and told him to follow his parole rules. Stefan heard Wang on the phone with his sister begging her to pick him up from a different location, but the prison wouldn't allow it. Wang knew we'd be there, and the fear was making him sick, just like our kids had been sick with fear that night. Stefan said Wang had thrown up twice that morning and couldn't eat anything. Manuel called a meeting the night before release to remind everyone about the civil suit the families had filed against the city. He said we couldn't do anything illegal, or it would give Wang's lawyer ammunition to get the case thrown out. Everyone promised to stay within the law, but we all knew there were plenty of legal ways to make Wang's life miserable. Manuel said the suit was asking for $3 million, and the city was already talking about settling. That night, I couldn't sleep at all and kept walking around my empty house. I stood in Cecilia's room and looked at her bed with the princess sheets she'd picked out. I thought about those 10 minutes when she was in that van with zip ties on her wrists. I thought about how Wang sat there eating his sandwich while my baby was being driven further away. I thought about the other 2 girls who'd been missing for weeks because nobody believed their parents either. My phone kept buzzing with messages from other watch members who couldn't sleep either. The alarm went off at 4:30 and I was already dressed because I never went to bed. Blake picked me up in his truck, and we drove to the prison in the dark, while Stefan texted us updates from inside. Wang had been up all night too, and the guards said he kept throwing up in his cell toilet. We parked across from the back exit where they release people and watched 13 more cars pull up with watch members getting out. Manuel had told us to stay on public property and not block any roads, so we stood on the sidewalk holding our phones ready to record. The transport van pulled around at 5:50, and we could see Wang's face pressed against the window looking right at us. He ducked down so fast his head made a thump we could hear from outside. The van sat there for 10 minutes while they processed his paperwork, and we just stood there watching and waiting. His sister's blue Honda pulled up, and she wouldn't look at any of us as she walked to the processing door. Stefan sent a text that Wang was refusing to leave the building, and the guards were getting mad at him. They finally pushed him out the door at 6:15, and he ran to his sister's car so fast he tripped on the curb and scraped his hands on the concrete. She drove off going the wrong way down the one-way street to avoid passing us, but Derek was already following in his car. Wang's sister took the highway, then got off 3 exits later and doubled back through downtown. She ran 2 yellow lights and made 4 sudden turns without signaling. But we had 25 people spread across the whole county. Every time she thought she lost us, another watch member would pick them up and text their location. Blake was tracking everything on his tablet and calling out directions while I drove behind them at a distance. They went through a drive-thru for coffee, and the kid at the window recognized Wang from Valerie's broadcast and dropped the cups when he saw him. Wang's sister drove for 2 more hours making random turns before finally heading to her house on Maple Street. Every single neighbor was standing in their front yards when they pulled up. Nobody said anything or moved, but they all just watched as Wang got out of the car. He looked around at all the faces, then ran inside so fast he left his prison release bag on the driveway. His sister grabbed it and followed him in, and we didn't see them again for 3 whole days. Stefan's cousin lived on that street and said Wang never even went near the windows. The mailman told Rania that Wang's sister was picking up groceries at weird hours to avoid people. On the 4th day, Wang finally went to the food mart at 10 in the morning when it was supposed to be empty. But Rania had been shopping there every morning since his release just in case. She pushed her cart into the cereal aisle right when Wang was reaching for a box of cornflakes. He froze when he saw her and dropped the box, which exploded all over the floor. She didn't say one word, but kept her eyes locked on his, while she slowly reached past him for her own cereal. Wang backed away and went to the next aisle, but Rania followed with her cart making this awful squeaking noise. He tried the frozen food section, but she was there looking at ice cream. He went to the deli counter, but she was suddenly interested in lunch meat. After 20 minutes, Wang left his full cart in the middle of the store and ran out to his sister's car. The manager came over and asked Rania if everything was okay, and she said she was just doing her weekly shopping. That same afternoon, Derek went to the gym Wang used to go to 5 times a week. He talked to the desk girl about membership prices and mentioned he knew Wang from before prison. The girl's face went white and she called the manager over, who turned out to have a 9-year-old daughter. The manager pulled up Wang's account and canceled it on the spot, saying anyone who endangers children wasn't welcome in his business. He even refunded Wang's remaining membership to mail him a check so Wang couldn't come argue about it. 2 days later, Wang tried to eat at the Italian place on 3rd Street where he used to take clients for lunch. The owner met him at the door and said the restaurant was fully booked even though we could see empty tables everywhere. Wang asked for takeout, but the owner said the kitchen was closed for maintenance. Then the owner mentioned his nephew went to the school with one of the girls from the van, and Wang left without saying another word. After 2 weeks of this, Wang's sister called the police saying we were stalking and harassing them. The officer who came out was named Rodriguez, and his kids went to the same school where half the parents were still dealing with trauma from that night. He took the report and told Wang's sister he'd look into it, but then mentioned how understaffed they were and how these cases take time to investigate. Wang started applying for jobs online, but somehow Valerie's article about the unnamed officer who nearly let 3 girls die kept getting forwarded to every company he contacted. One hiring manager called Manuel to thank him for the heads up about Wang's history. Wang couldn't even get interviews at places desperate for workers. A month into his parole, Wang was supposed to be home by 8 every night, but he got turned around trying to avoid watch members who happened to be out walking their dogs on his usual route. He didn't get home until 8:40, and his parole officer had already called twice. The officer gave him an official warning and told him one more violation would send him back to finish his full sentence. That night, Wang's sister showed up at my door crying and begging us to leave them alone. She said Wang had learned his lesson and just wanted to move on with his life. Rania was there for our meeting and looked the sister right in the face. She told her our children learned lessons too about what happens when people in power don't care if they live or die. She said Cecilia still wakes up screaming about zip ties and vans. She said the other parents have kids who won't sleep without checking the locks over and over. Wang's sister said it wasn't fair to punish him forever, but Rania asked her if she thought 18 months was fair for almost letting 3 little girls disappear forever. Wang's sister left crying that night, but 6 weeks later her brother made our job easier when his ankle monitor showed him walking past Jefferson Elementary at 2:30 in the afternoon. He claimed his GPS glitched and he was actually 3 blocks away at the gas station, but the parole officer pulled the security footage from both locations, and Wang was clearly visible walking right along the school fence while kids were getting out. The parole violation hearing took 15 minutes, and the judge sent him back to finish his full 18-month sentence with no possibility of early release this time. Stefan texted us from the prison that Wang looked broken when they brought him back in, and the other inmates were already talking about the child endangerer who couldn't stay away from schools. We met at my house that night and everyone was quiet, but satisfied because we'd bought ourselves another year to make sure Wang could never hide what he'd done. Manuel started working with a private investigator to create a detailed file on Wang, including court transcripts and victim impact statements that we could send to any employer or landlord who might consider giving him a chance. Valerie wrote more articles about police negligence without naming Wang directly, but including enough details that anyone could connect the dots if they searched for officers imprisoned in our state that year. Meanwhile, Cecilia was finally sleeping through the night again and had started making friends at the school, including a girl named Maya, whose family just moved here from Texas. She didn't know anything about Wang or what we were doing because I kept all watch meetings at other houses now and made sure she never overheard our phone calls. The therapist said she was making great progress and might not need weekly sessions much longer, which made me cry with relief in the parking lot after our appointment. 8 months into Wang's second stint in prison, the civil suit against the city finally settled for an amount that would cover Cecilia's therapy and education, plus damages for the trauma she endured. The settlement documents became public record, and for the first time, Wang's full name appeared in official paperwork connected to the case because the city had to list him as the officer whose actions led to the lawsuit. Valerie made sure the settlement got coverage in 3 different news outlets, and suddenly Wang's name started appearing in Google searches, linked to child endangerment and police negligence. By the time Wang finished his full sentence 14 months later, his reputation was destroyed everywhere within a 100-mile radius of our town. The private investigator we hired confirmed Wang couldn't get callbacks for any job applications, and 3 apartment complexes had already rejected his rental applications after running background checks. His sister sold her house and moved to Arizona without telling anyone in the neighborhood where she was going, but we found out through property records that she'd bought a place in Tucson. Wang had no choice but to follow her there since nobody here would rent to him or hire him, and even the cheap motels suddenly had no vacancies when he tried to check in. The watch started meeting monthly instead of weekly, and we shifted our focus from destroying Wang to supporting other families dealing with police negligence. We created resource lists for trauma therapists and victims' rights attorneys, and set up a fund to help families who couldn't afford legal representation. 2 years passed, and Cecilia was thriving in 5th grade, making straight A's and playing soccer on the school team. She only occasionally asked about that scary night when she was little, and I told her bad things happened. But our community came together to make sure those bad things couldn't happen to other kids. She seemed satisfied with that answer and went back to talking about her science project on butterflies. The private investigator sent us updates every few months, and we learned Wang was working night shifts at a distribution warehouse outside Phoenix where nobody knew his history. He lived in a studio apartment 40 minutes from his job and had no social media presence and no friends that anyone could identify. His sister had cut contact with him after neighbors in Tucson found out who he was and started asking questions about why she was harboring someone who'd endangered children. Wang knew we were still watching because every 6 months someone from the watch would send him an anonymous letter with a photo of the 3 girls he almost let disappear, just to remind him that we hadn't forgotten and never would. The justice system gave him 18 months, but we gave him a life sentence of accountability and isolation. He'd gambled with our babies' lives for a promotion he never got, and lost everything, including his freedom and reputation, and any chance of living peacefully anywhere near the children he'd failed to protect. The watch still meets monthly, and we've helped 12 families navigate the system when police failed their children, and we keep detailed records of every officer who dismisses a parent's fears about their missing child. We couldn't change what happened that night, but we made sure Wang paid a price that matched his crime, and we built something powerful from our pain that protects other families from going through what we did. Thanks for letting me wonder alongside you through all of this today. It's definitely been interesting sharing these moments together. Take care. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.